On the 27th of September, the UK will celebrate a historic milestone, and as many of you know, it heralds 200 years of the first modern railway. But of course, railways didn't just appear overnight. It took decades of development to make the railway happen. While some developments and ideas were gradual and hard to pinpoint the exact timeline, there was one that was not: the Surrey Iron Railway. The fast-flowing water of the River Wandle was an ideal place for the greatest power source of the early Middle Ages, the water wheel. Water wheels provided a great source of power to the many mills, and other than the equipment, it was provided free and cleanly. The power from the wheel could be used to power many things, from grinding stones to looms. It had been used for centuries, starting with the production of flour, but as demand for final products such as paper and tobacco grew, so did the manufacturing processes, and with it better machinery, all powered by the water wheel. By the start of the 19th century, over 3,000 people, 200 horses and 50 mills were operating up and down the river. But while the river was great for power, moving goods was an expensive and difficult venture. Upriver, the wharves were difficult to access, and the turnpikes were in a pitiful state, certainly not in a state to take the amount of goods that the mills were churning out. In 1789, several mill owners and manufacturers came together to make a plan that would solve the shipping problem. At the time, canal fever was in full swing, and it was decided that a canal from Wandsworth to Croydon would solve the majority of the problems. The canal would be created near to the Wandle, and to lead the project, canal legend William Jessup was called in to be the consulting engineer. Another engineer, Benjamin Outram, was also called in to help. But after a feasibility study and several meetings with local landowners, a serious problem would emerge. There was no proper way to supply this new canal with water, other than using the River Wandle, in which the owners were understandably not keen. The idea of a canal was, in Jessup's case, impractical. But Jessup had another idea. If a canal wasn't going to work, what about a railway? Railways would be cheaper to build and maintain, and had very good successes in the coal mines in the north. A railway would be beneficial for each owner, as each owner could have a branch line to each of their mills, and it was estimated that the railway would carry upwards of 30,000 tonnes per year, and if all the owners paid into it to fund it, it was estimated dividends would be around 10%. It was an unusual proposal, but the owners were intrigued. But were even more intrigued when Jessup proposed that the railway should be made for the public for freight. This was never heard of or done before, but if it was extra revenue, they decided to entertain the idea. Who knows? It might catch on. A new railway opened just a few years before and had introduced a new concept: cast iron edged rails. The rails were deep and wide with upper flanges to help guide the trucks. Jessup had designed these himself for the Blenavon and Beaufort Railway in 1794 and were working well. At the same time, another type of rail was being trialled. It was similar to Jessup's design, however it wasn't as deep and the flange was set on the inner edge. This was so standard wheels would work with it. Designed by an engineer called John Kerr, he had used them on several railways with varying successes. Outram had also dabbled in railway development as well, but his contribution lay under the rails by experimenting with some stone sleepers, eventually using his knowledge and some modification to Kerr's design to help create the Little Eaton tramway. Jessup had been in touch with both engineers, and using both Kerr's ideas and Outram's sleepers, he proposed to abandon the canal altogether for this new railway. After much deliberation, it was eventually approved. The railway passed through Parliament and shares were offered to raise the capital. Jessup was appointed chief engineer and the Surrey Iron Railway Company was born. It was the first ever public railway and it was opened in 1803. Each sleeper held the rails up, and both rail and sleeper were held together with a plug of oak and an iron nail. The rails were flanged at each side, with the wheels sitting in the groove. This meant that wagons could be taken on and off the railway with ease. The gauge was also unusual, set at 4 foot 2 inches. The rails were made in Ben Outram's foundry in Butterley in a perfect partnership, and while the railway was in itself its own company, any member of the public could pay the railway to use it. However, the public had to provide their own horses and their own wagons. The railway solved the goods problem and was proven to be just as efficient as canals of the time. Developments a few years later saw a new type of power, steam engines. However, after an experiment on a similar railway, it was discovered that the new steam engines were a tad heavy for the delicate rails. A tad is an understatement. The railway engines destroyed them. So the railway remained horse-drawn, and anyone was free to use it, and its profits grew. It eventually had branch lines to other towns in Karlshoughton and Mersham, but even though steam engines couldn't travel on the rails, they did have an impact. As the steam engine found its way into mills and factories, there was less of a requirement to be by the waterside, and mills found that they could expand nearly anywhere. In addition, railway engines could move much more than horsepower and with much greater pace. Still, the railway held on until the 1st of August 1846. With the inclusion of more railway stations, the iron railway simply couldn't keep afloat and was forced to close for good. The railway left a lasting legacy. It was the first to be available to the public, and one of the first to show the public what railways could really do. Over 200 years, remnants of the railway still remain. In the Wandle Industrial Museum, there is a piece of the old railway, still with Ben Outram's maker's mark visible, and amazingly a wagon wheel that ran on the railway was recovered from the riverbank. Some of the sleepers were incorporated into buildings, and part of the track bed was used for the Wimbledon to West Croydon Railway and opened up in 1855. Only closing briefly in the 90s, while modifications were made to make it part of today's Croydon tramlink system, which you can still travel on today, marking the land being used for railways for over 224 years.